So with Marcuse ending that part, he talked about liberation would not only mean the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly, things like the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, blah, 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 but also oppression of those who oppose the extension of this and that. In other words, quote, liberating tolerance means intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. He knew what he was talking about. He'd been in America for decades by this time. And, it was when we think about critical theory and his impact there, his influence was just incredibly, incredibly profound. I'm having a struggle to try to push past some of this stuff because it's so important, but you'll be able to get much of it from that other article as well. Because we're living in the impact right now of critical theory. Yeah, Time magazine said about him that he was one of the top people in 100 years. He was the guru of the New Left. Again, in Europe, 1968, he was a 1968er. They would hold signs up, Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. He's just that influential in terms of his lasting impact. The faculty advisor, basically, of the 60s sexual revolution. And as we'll see eventually, it constitutes the repudiation. The left, they lost in the 60s when it came to race and the civil rights with Martin Luther King. But now they have repudiated Martin Luther King and the gains that were had there with the integration of critical theory and critical race theory. So it's not just race theory. It's not just righting the wrongs of the past. It's trying a new cure that's worse than the disease because it's the Marxist cure. There were problems in the past, but you do not want this cure. In one word, we can define critical race theory as racial postmodernized neo-Marxism. You have an idea what neo-Marxism is: cultural Marxism, Western Marxism, critical theoretical Marxism, with a postmodern impetus in it, and then plug race in, you have critical race theory. Now, Marx was a modernist in the modernist period, not a postmodernist. That came later. But the postmodernism element of France and its relativism and the idea that knowledge is a social construct of reality came in to this mix with the neo-Marxism. If you think about the metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics of critical theory, the metaphysics of human relations is binary opposing groups. The ethic is because one is oppressed by the other, you've got to right the wrong by social justice because it's socially unjust. What do I mean by injustice? Not getting what you deserve, but inequality. Inequality just means injustice. And because it's now cultural and not just economic, like Marx held, it applies to class, race, sex, gender, inequality on any of those. So now you've got a critical theory that applies to sex, one that applies to gender, one that applies to race, one that applies to class, one that applies to nationality, one applies to ethnicity, one that applies to ability even, one that applies to religion. And now they all come together as well with the postmodern mix, starting with intersectionality, which was the first video we looked at. And remember, in that classroom, some of them had multiple privilege points because they were oppressed in multiple different subgroups. And if you're black and woman and gay and transgender, and maybe you have just one leg, you're like the perfect unicorn. And so you can see with almost like Superman X-ray vision, you've got such wokeness. You dwarf the ordinary black man. You're a black woman, uh, lesbian, one-legger who's poor and has hairs on his nipples like that in that video, right? Oh, yeah, that's bad. Neo-Marxism did not die in the Cold War. Last week, I had the privilege to meet a student in the protest from Tiananmen Square massacre in China in 1989. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. In the West, people thought this is great. Communism's dead, Marxism's over. It wasn't. And those failed revolutions in Germany and Italy did not fail. They went dormant. They migrated and incubated and were very strategic, patient, and very stern on their methods and strategies. And now they're taking over the US universities, for example, dominating them from the administrative buildings, striking fear into everybody. Terrorism, as Marx called it. In 1989, the same year, is when critical race theory started in the United States. With Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the PhD protege of Derek Bell, critical legal studies. They thought in critical legal studies, black critical legal studies in particular, they thought that the civil rights were going too slow and that it wasn't serious enough. You needed to infuse the civil rights movement with Marxism. Race plus critical theory gave critical race theory. And Kimberly Crenshaw, the student of Derek Bell, was the first one to coin the term intersectionality and brought in the postmodern element as well. So the present culture wars can be seen as a dispute over our acceptance or rejection of what we might synonymously refer to as cultural Marxism, neo-Marxism, critical theory, political correctness, identity politics, social justice. Call it what you want. It's like throwing a bunch of socks on the wall. If one of those fit, those terms are likely synonymous. Critical theory is the reigning paradigm in academic disciplines like gender studies, women's studies, peace studies, critical race theory, anthropology, queer theory, liberation theology, which is a hybrid of Marxism and Christianity, where Christianity is the shell and Marxism is the core. And it forms the ideological foundation for large segments of the social justice movement. Critical theory characterized, and then you just add race to it. Individual identity is inseparable from group identity as oppressed or oppressor. Oppressor groups subjugate oppressed groups through exercise of hegemonic power. There's Gramsci. Our fundamental moral duty is freeing groups from oppression. That's our fundamental duty. That's the goal of ethics. Lived experience, here's the epistemology, is more important than objective evidence in understanding oppression. Remember the video? It's not all about facts, it's about feelings. Neil Shenvi, who wrote that booklet, got canceled at one of our Ratio Christi events recently because he wasn't black. We held a debate on the East Coast and the university wouldn't let us debate because neither the proponent nor opponent were female, and reproductive justice says males have no lived experience, they have nothing to offer. Part of Crenshaw's dispute in mapping the margins was it's not enough to be a black male because a black female gets oppressed by the black male. So it's the intersection of various oppressed groups that have the moral authority because they have the wokeness, the insight, the esoteric perspective on reality. So they didn't want to deconstruct everything in postmodern, French postmodernism, the movement of deconstructionism, because then you would have to deconstruct deconstructionism. It's the problem with the skeptic. If you're going to be a skeptic, you got to be skeptical of skepticism. That's not okay. You got to stop somewhere. So where do you stop? You're going to stop and say there is objective knowledge. Knowledge is a social construction of reality. We construct it by our language, but only the woke can really see the reality. The woke oppressed. The oppressors are blind. They just need to listen. White, male, heteronormative, capitalist, able bodied, Christians, those are the matrices of massive oppression. That person, me in particular, I'm as blind as a bat and there's no hope for me. Even if I had a Christian Christ and I was redeemed and I was sorry for all of my whiteness, all of my maleness, all of my heteronormativeness, it's not enough. I'm white. I'm plagued by it. I can't get rid of it. I just have to sit and listen. Oppressor groups hide their oppression under the guise of objectivity. That's why Peter Boghossian, the atheist, my arch enemy who wrote the book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, he and I were called logical fascists. We're getting ready to tour 4 universities in Texas in the fall now that COVID has opened up. But we're getting ready to face more hostility than even last time because this stuff is growing. It's snowballing. Individuals at the intersection of different oppressed groups experience oppression in a unique way. 1989, seminal year. The wall fell, Tiananmen Square. Marxism died. No, it didn't. The German, the Italian cultural Marxist revolutions failed. No, they didn't. They have the potential of becoming the greatest revolutions of Marxism ever. The Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and Antonio Gramsci emerged as a combined think tank on how to develop more of a soft revolution from within by infiltration of civil rather than political society, certain institutional or structural aspects of culture to engage in a war of position. It's all about the group, the collective. It's all about structural, institutional, systemic racism, group, collective. Old terms are dead. Racism. Racism doesn't mean what we thought it once meant because knowledge is a social construction of reality and we use language to construct the new reality. If there's inequality, it means there is systemic injustice. How did it take root? Well, we've talked about that. I'm going to press on. This is a very important book by Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility. That was the New York Times bestseller. This is actually a more important book from her. Is Everyone Really Equal? An Introduction to Key Concepts in Social Justice Education. Remember, Hitler said, give me the textbooks and I will control Germany. Abraham Lincoln said that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. Infiltrate the educational and ecclesial institutes and you take civil society. In this, she has her minoritized group on the left. Now, mind you, she's not saying minority. Minority is the old term. Women in America, for example, are actually the majority numerically, but they're called minoritized because they're still oppressed by the patriarchy. And so the minoritized group is peoples of color. The oppression is racism, and the dominant agent group is white. Now, there is called brown privilege now, too. And so brown privilege is social, unmerited social benefits that non-blacks have that blacks lack. So now browns need to bend the knee to blacks and listen in America. But whites need to bend the knee and bow to browns. And if they're a female, that's an added bonus. And if they're lesbian, that's an added bonus. So the poor, working class, middle class, that's classism. The dominant agent group, the owning class. Minoritized target group, women, transgender, genderqueer. The oppression, sexism. Dominant group, cis men. Gays, lesbians, bis, two-spirited. The oppression, heterosexism. The dominant group, heterosexuals. Minoritized group, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, Hindus, other non-Christian groups. Oppression, religious oppression. The dominant group, the oppressors, the Christians. Remember, the postmodernists don't like meta-narratives. The Bible is the ultimate meta-narrative, and God is the ultimate oppressor. People with disabilities, it's ableism. The dominant group, able-bodied. Minoritized group, immigrants. Oppression, nationalism. Dominant group, citizens. Ooh, citizens. Antifa doesn't like citizens because they don't like nations. That's why they call everybody fascists. And they are called Antifa, anti-fascists, because they're Marxists. Here's the metaphysics, the epistemology, the ethics of critical race theory, and its method is via the hegemonic narrative. You've got to recreate the narrative, stories by lived experience, appeal to pity, to show that you're part of one or more oppressed groups. Cry as loud as you can, and the pity will pour in. And the idea behind DIE, for example, diversity, inclusivity, equity. If you have a DIE officer at your university, you know it's the death of that institute. Because diversity is you look out there and you acknowledge oppressed and oppressor groups. Inclusivity is you exclude the oppressor groups and include only the oppressed groups. So you assess blame. And equity is the word that has replaced equality, as Sten Hoyer, I think the Democratic candidate for president this last time around, he was one of the billionaires. He didn't make it, obviously. But when he was asked on the news, do you believe in reparations for past slave activity in America, going back to 1619, they say, the 1619 Project? He said, absolutely. And they said, well, for how long? He said, well, from 1619 to 2019 is about 400 years, so I would say about 400 years. Equity is not just equality, it is payback, it is revenge. There is no forgiveness in this. There is no absolution of sin. Richard Dawkins recently apologized because the woke crowd took away his 25-year Medal of Honor from the Humanist Society because while he's pro-feminist and pro-lesbian, like J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter, he came out against the transgender mob, and he was quickly made to bow and to apologize for that. And he tried to ask for forgiveness. They would not forgive. His Medal of Honor has been stripped. There is no forgiveness, Richard. You're a slow learner. But even for the left, the new left demands the whole of you. Marx, Mao, and Marcuse, the legacy of 1968. So liberation theology and critical race theory, coming a different direction. Critical race theory, I'm afraid to push, oh, there we go. Critical race theory, this comes out of Richard Delgado. He was one of the founders of critical race theory. Him and Stephen Stefanchik, in their book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction, they define it this way early on. The critical race movement is a collection of activists. Now, wait right there. Theory is supposed to be interpreting reality, interpreting the phenomena, right? But remember, Marx said philosophers have historically interpreted reality. The goal is, after all, to change it. Activism. Critical race theory is not an interpretive framework as they're trying to make it out to be, a helpful interpretive framework. It's an activist movement finding evidence in support of the theory. You don't build the theory from the evidence, from the data. You start with theory and you punish evildoers who disagree. That's the end goal. The theory is already there. The first four letters say it all. Theology. It's a God's eye viewpoint. The critical race movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective. Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces the slow progress nonetheless, incrementalism and step by step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. They repudiate the virtues of the civil rights movement. The Marxists do not like John Locke's equal rights, individual rights. They're not about equality in that sense. They're about equity. And you take one for the team. They're not about freedom, because as Lenin said, we do not have freedom until we have utopia. There is no neutrality in the law. That's why they're about dismantling the police, dismantling the law. Anarchists and Marxists have the same goal. They simply differ as to the means. And this is why critical race theory began within critical legal studies and then morphed with its postmodern intersectionality and some other elements in 1989. There is a racial component in everything, Ibram Kendi said as I sat in his lecture at Purdue University earlier this year. He came in, and such a generous communist got paid $17,500 for a 45-minute Zoom call, and he made $300,000 this whole past year on top of his endowed chaired salary position at Boston University, and on top of his best-selling author royalties. But of course, he's just going to give it all back, right? Because that's what Mao did, and Lenin, and Marx. And they all, once they got to the top, they just redistributed the wealth. No. In his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, the dilemma is, do you want to be a racist? I asked this to an apologetics audience last month in Chicago. I asked for a raise of hands. I said, how many of you want to be a racist? Raise your hands. Nobody. In America, probably around the world right now, it's probably worse to be called a racist than a rapist, right? No one wants to raise their hand on that one, and rightfully so. But we're not even told, we're told what racism is something different, and we're just told to agree. So I said, how many of you want to be anti-racist? Half the room in an apologetics seminar raised their hands. And I said, good, sign right here, and then I'll tell you what's in it. Sounds like a healthcare bill a couple of years ago in the US from Nancy Pelosi. You got to sign it first to find out what's in it. You got to pass it first. Do you want to be a racist? No. So, okay, so you want to be an anti-racist? Yes. Okay. Here's what that means. Anti-racist policies cannot eliminate class racism without anti-capitalism policies. To truly be anti-racist is to be feminist. To truly be feminist is to be anti-racist. We cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. To be queer anti-racist is to understand the privileges of my cisgender, of my masculinity, of my heterosexuality, of the rest of everything else. With intersectionality, it's a Trojan horse that brings in all of it. Chew the meat and spit out the bones with cultural Marxism. You can't. You have to adopt the whole. And you're going to choke on those bones if you're a Christian. If you like some of the things they put out, it cannot be Marxism. It's just you like some other ideas that you could have without Marxism. You don't need Marxism, especially when the cure is worse than the disease.
Profession of faith for Catholic for Southern Baptist is
Uh-oh, sorry, someone's got something going. So at the end of the talk, some white gentleman approached the stage and said, I'm so sorry, I feel so guilty. What do I do? How do I help? I'm a racist. And he said, well, look, there is a racial component in everything. He said, for example, let's say you're passionate about climate change. climate justice. Well, because climate laws currently impact disproportionately the colored people in the third world, if you pass climate change laws, then you can be anti-racist. But if you don't pass those laws, you're still a racist because it's systemic racism, institutional racism, structural racism that's racism. So don't worry. Just get on the board with climate laws and then reproductive justice, abortion, and economic justice, socialism, and feminist justice, and gender justice, and homophobic justice, and and love the poor too. In addition to everything in that Trojan horse, chew the meat, spit out the bones. You're going to choke and die as a Christian. Jonathan Haidt, the NYU professor of psychology and the New York Times best-selling author. I'm part of his network called the Heterodox Academy, as opposed to Orthodox. It's got about 5,000 professors in it who share a variety of viewpoints, and it advocates viewpoint diversity. He's an atheist. He's a leftist, but he is very scared of the new left right now. He says right now at our juncture, you can go to YouTube and pull up his lecture at Duke University. Pull up Jonathan Haidt, Social Justice, Duke University. His 2-hour lecture is great. He says, we are at the juncture in the U.S. universities where we must choose. Either we're going to have truth universities or social justice universities, but you cannot have both. University of Berkeley just spent $25 million on 400 DIE personnel, staff. DIE staff are political officers who guide political thought. They're the most important part of the universities, and our seminaries are getting killed by them now too. The holy trinity of death: diversity, identify oppressed groups in terms of systemic power and privilege; inclusivity, assess blame of oppressor groups; equity, rectify the injustice by redistributing outcomes of power and privilege. Do not fall for the idea that these are innocuous, tame, good job positions. These are the political officers of the Red Army, but clandestine under Gramsci and critical theoretical Western cultural Marxism. You're busy putting sand in the moat in the war of position, getting ready for the war of movement, the frontal attack, at which time it will be decisive. There's equality. Yeah, we're not all equal. Some are short, some are tall. Look, culture entails diet even. Certain foods, and foods provide issues about lifespan and health. Culture's much deeper. You're never going to control equality of outcome. But the Marxists think we can, and they call it equity. And it makes everybody poorer. Look at Venezuela. Think about my grades, how I taught how I will grade people on equality of outcome, on equity, because of past inequalities. Everybody will do poorer in the process. Capitalism's not perfect. The church is not perfect. But the solutions of those things have good solutions, and their cure is not worse than the disease. This was what, you can't see this, but the Smithsonian Institute put this up for days, and it was so reckless. Robin DiAngelo was behind it, I think, talking about whiteness. It talks about hard work. The Protestant work ethic is the key to success. Avoid it. Work before play. If you didn't meet your goals, you didn't work hard enough. So it's like it implies that blacks aren't good workers. Religion, Christianity is the norm. Anything other than Judeo-Christian tradition is foreign. No tolerance of deviation from single God concept. Status of power and authority. Wealth equals worth. Your job is who you are. Respect authority. Be on time. Yeah, blacks can't be on time. I mean, so it was so terrible they had to take it down quickly. But it is racism. Anti-racism is the neo-racism. Systemic, structural, institutional racism is real. but people are looking for it in the wrong places. The Chicago mayor recently said nationally she's not going to talk to white journalists anymore. She's only going to allow black journalists. Can you imagine if a white politician said that? And then the Washington, D.C. mayor backed her on it. This is something kind of interesting. We heard about George Floyd, and we heard about what happened in 2020. The police called in response to passing a counterfeit bill. The knee was on the back of the neck. About 5 minutes, about 8 minutes into it, he died. The officer was calm and serious, hands in pocket. The officer's reaction, there was none. Legal response, all the officers were arrested and charged, and one will spend maybe life in prison. Multiple funerals, congressional recognition, police reforms, name on everyone's lips. Say the name, say the name, say the name. A campaign that came from Robin DiAngelo or from Kimberly Crenshaw and some of the BLM folks that are the neo-Marxists. But how many of us actually heard about Tony Campo in 2016? Or Tony Timpa. He called the police himself and asked for help. The cop's knee and the hands were on the back and the neck. Not for 8 minutes, but for 14 minutes. The cops were mocking and laughing. The officers neither were arrested nor charged, and footage withheld for 3 years. No one knew his name, and you all just found out tonight for the first time ever. Why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't fit the theory. We're not interested in data and evidence. We're interested in theory. We are trained Marxists, said another Purdue speaker this year, the head of Black Lives Matters, Patrisse Cullors. We are trained Marxists. On our website, she's since scrubbed it. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively, there's the collective, care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, not fathers, parents, and children are comfortable. We foster a queer affirming network. When we gather together, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather, the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless she, he, or they disclose otherwise. I thought it was about Black lives. Nope. We are trained Marxists, and intersectionality includes it all. This guy was one of my classmates at Purdue when I took a class on Marxism. He's now a distinguished professor, or he's now a tenured professor at a university in Texas. And the attorney general in Texas is investigating him for doxing a police chief wife and for other things he said. He carries the Antifa flag, which has anarchism in black and socialism in red. His Facebook page, he claims to be Antifa. And he, following Diderot's famous quote behind the French Revolution, said in the media, "I want the entire world to burn until the last cop is strangled with the intestines of the last capitalist, who is strangled in turn with the intestines of the last politician." He used to wear makeup, have knuckles, brass knuckles, long trench coat. You thought he was going to shoot someone at school. But he had to interview for the job market, and he cleaned up really nice. Remember some of the protesters at Antifa rallies. One that hit someone in the face with a lock, gave him a concussion, was an ethics professor at the university. Black liberation theology, James Cone. There can be no theology of the gospel which does not arise from an oppressed community. Did you get that? This is the father of black theology. Before it came down from Central and South America, liberation theology, it began there, migrated north, and how it entered into black theology was through James Cone and other people. There can be no theology of the gospel which does not arise from an oppressed community. You see, liberation theology is a hybrid of Christianity and Marxism, but Christianity is only the shell. It's not the essence. Further, the God of the oppressed takes sides with the black community. God is not colorblind in the black-white struggle. Too bad, MLK. But has made an unqualified identification with blacks. You're no longer supposed to be colorblind. Anyone who claims to be colorblind and talks about having a dream of the content of character and not the color of skin is now branded a racist. The revolutionary context requires only one principle which guides the thinking and action of black theology: an unqualified commitment to the black community. That's his book, A Black Theology of Liberation. Reverend Wright was Obama's pastor and was trained by James Cone. My work with liberation theology, with Latin American theologians, with Black Theology Project, and what the Cuban Council of Churches taught me 30 years ago, the importance of Marx and the Marxist analysis of the sociologies of the vulnerable and the oppressed. Obama was in his church 20 years, baptized his kids there. But he wasn't impacted by this stuff, right? I mean, look at him. He wears a nice suit. Not in his days at college. When he wrote in his own book, I was aware of this before he ran because I smelled Marxism. I trained in Marxism. To avoid being mistaken for a sellout, I chose my friends carefully, the more politically active black students, the Marxist professors, and structural feminists. At night in the dorms, we discussed neocolonialism, Eurocentrism, and patriarchy. Ibram X. Kendi recently called Amy Coney Barrett, who became the newest Supreme Court member, a colonizer because she adopted 2 Haitian black children. The largest adoption agency in America, Bethany Adoption Services, not only went LGBT last year, but last month they decided they're going to reconsider whether they adopt out black babies to white parents because of systemic racism. Colonizers. Raphael Warnock, who we saw earlier say the earlier church was a socialist church, now Senator Raphael Warnock, whose pulpit most recently was MLK's pulpit in Georgia. Reverend Dr. Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock did James Cone's eulogy and was James Cone's PhD student. The early church was a socialist church. Go back and read the Bible. We need to level the playing field, and to be concerned about the poor does not make you a socialist. It makes you a Christian. So any atheist who cares about the poor is a Christian. And it means that you believe that everybody is a child of God. Well, last I checked, you have to become a child of God through being born again. You're born, by nature, a child of the devil. He said recently in an April 2021 tweet that got deleted, the meaning of Easter is more transcendent than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Whether you're a Christian or not, through a commitment to helping others, we are able to save ourselves. A PhD under James Cone. Liberation theology is questionably Christian. It's more Marxist. We already looked at that. This is what happened when Kimberly Crenshaw wrote the book Mapping the Margins in the 60s, Civil Rights Movement. You had this picture that was there. This is real. All the black men were marching with, "I am a man. I am a man. I am a man." In other words, I should be treated like everybody else, equal. Kimberly Crenshaw says, no, you are a black man. Why the attraction as we come to a close? Well, neo-atheism got nothing on neo-Marxism. Neo-atheism was dry, dull. It was about science. Neo-Marxism is about justice. It's wet and juicy. It's about compassion, love. What would Jesus do? It's infiltrated our seminaries, our campus ministries, our Christian academic societies at the highest levels and the biggest ones, and our churches, splitting right down the middle, thus Vodi Baucham's book, Fault Lines. And today I tour universities with my arch enemy, a liberal atheist philosopher, and we argue against the new left, against cancel culture, to keep the lights on because debate ain't hate. Slavery and other narratives. It's appeal to pity. Cry foul. America's original sin was the 1619 Project in Virginia when the first slave ship arrived. Actually, in fact, the 20 people, blacks, were indentured servants, the same as 1/3 of all whites that came over from Germany and England. It grew into the slavery we know what it became. But let's face the facts, data matters. Out of 12 million people that boarded the transatlantic slave trade, 10 million made it alive, only 400,000 came to America. The rest went down to Central South America and other places. Only 400,000 came to America. And it was bad. But ask yourself the question, if the original sin of America was slavery, what was the original sin of Africa? Who do you think captured 90% of the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade? Blacks. 90%. In fact, before that, a century before that, over 1 million whites were kidnapped and brought to Africa as slaves. That's more than 400,000. A lot of those Africans made a lot of money on this. Today, we have 350,000 Nigerian immigrants in America. Where did they get that generational wealth? On average, they're more wealthy and more well-educated than the average American. If the whole issue is about generational poverty caused by the legacy of slavery, well, then what about the 300,000 Northern soldiers? The only time in human history, and slavery has existed from human history in every culture, the only time it was race was in this case, and the only time that a bloody battle was fought to end slavery was when 300,000 gave their lives. And you give your life at that time as the breadwinner, you send your children and your wife into generational poverty. Do you think the West African nations or Nigeria, the immigrants, should pay reparations? Does Obama count as a recipient or a reparation payer? He's 50-50. How would we ever do that? When would forgiveness be a thing? And besides, as Thomas Sowell, the Stanford economist, makes the case, the legacy of the welfare state of the 60s policies has been far worse, according to data, than the legacy of slavery from 100 years after the Civil War happened in America. Most blacks were still in a nuclear family, and everybody knows that the number one predictor of poverty is fatherlessness. That came about in our time. But why is it so attractive? Because we cry pity to a legitimate problem, but we exacerbate it, or we exaggerate it, or we distort it for our theoretical ends. We manipulate the facts just like Marx did. Redefining of racism as unilateral and structural. Look, this is the definition. See how problematic it is. Systemic racism is any practice or policy that creates or perpetuates racial disparity or inequality. Well, guess what does that? Marriage does that. Everyone knows that the greatest predictor of poverty is fatherlessness. And if you don't get married or stay married, That's going to create inequality. So what should we do? Tear down the nuclear Western prescribed family. Let the village raise them. Marriage is a practice and policy that creates or perpetuates disparity or inequality. But guess what? Not all inequality is injustice. It might be. You got to look at the evidence. Inequality is a mathematical notion. Injustice is a moral one. Basketball is a policy that privileges tall people and for generations puts billions of dollars in their family generational line. It oppresses the short and privileges with power the tall because they have policies that the hoops need to be 10 feet tall. Incarceration rates through the roof. They're black. Yes, but they're also male. 90-something% of incarcerated prisoners are male. I guess that's sexism, but no one's claiming that. And there are many black scholars who deny systemic racism. You just don't hear it in the media. Should Christians support social justice? Well, look, the Bible is filled with commands to care for the poor, defend the powerless, seek justice for the widow, the orphan, the oppressed. Christians should use care to adopt rhetoric, words that subvert Christianity. Stick with biblical terms like justice, like compassion. Jesus is the Jew we follow, not Marx. Jesus gives us what we need, not Marx. Social justice is not necessarily just. Most of the time, it's unjust. Economic justice, socialism, racial justice, gospel of anti-racism, which is just new racism. Reproductive justice, abortion, gender, LGBTQIAP justice, polyamory, and multi-identity. Research justice, only use minoritized texts. Climate justice, human trafficking. Finally, we get a social justice one. But most of the stuff in that Trojan horse, the same word for justice is the same word for righteous. How many of those are righteous? It's often driven more through the lens of sociology and culture than the lens of theology and scripture. And pastors are too concerned with skinny jeans and fog machines and the latest fads than they are being guided by scripture. When it comes to the public relations war, truth, and the rhetoric of cultural apologetics, we do well to pay attention to Abraham Lincoln. In this age, in this country, public sentiment is everything. Emotions. With it, nothing can fail. Against it, nothing can succeed. The reason it's so successful from Marx onward is because it makes the appeal to pity. It looks at inequality and it assumes that it's injustice and finds some bad cases like a woman with a hanger in a back alley with abortion and sells the rest of the house to it. Critical theory has emerged from its Marxist origins in our universities and spread to the church under another popular name, social justice, the liberation of all forms of oppression. That's what it means. Well, that's our doctrinal statement. It's got gospel problems. Our primary identity is the imago Dei and our identity in Christ. Saints and sinners, everyone, all lives matter because all lives are sacred. But not all lives matter, not even black lives, if God does not exist, because the unsanctifier of human life. Knowledge, authority, the Bible's the ultimate authority. It's not the ultimate hegemonic power oppressor. We are guided by theology and scripture, not sociology and culture. We've got to get justice right, getting what you deserve, and not confuse it with charity or grace, as in social justice. Otherwise, the gospel doesn't make sense. The wages of sin is death. You get what you deserve. The gift of God is eternal life. We can have racial reconciliation only when we recognize the proper foundations. Further investigation, go to ratiochristi.org, look at our publications, all of them, not just the one on this topic. Center for Biblical Unity.com. I was with her last week. Great website, former Marxist. Go to neilshinviapologetics.com to read more. Vodi Bakum, former atheist, Malcolm X lover, now is a doctor in theology and lives in Africa and is part of a seminary. He wrote the recent book that's a bestseller right now, just came out this month, Fault Lines, The Looming Catastrophe in Evangelicalism. Carol Swain, she's a personal supporter of mine. She's the head of the 1776 Project. She was a cultural Marxist. She went from GRE to PhD, had 11 kids in her family, didn't have any running water, impregnated at age 16, got married, divorced. She went on to Princeton, went on to Vanderbilt, to Yale, finally became a Christian when she was at Vanderbilt, became tenured, and has the Nobel equivalent in her field of political science and law. And she's Black and female and a personal supporter of mine. Thomas Sowell, one of the greatest economists of our time, Stanford. He's got 50 books on the topic. He was a Marxist in college. He went to Columbia University, where Marcuse and everyone went, where Obama went. He went to Harvard, then to Yale. Now he's at Stanford. 50 books. Thomas Sowell's friend at the Hoover Institute, same thing at Stanford. He wrote the book White Guilt, How Blacks and Whites Together Have Destroyed the Promise of the Civil Rights Movement. He also spoke here at Purdue. Glenn Loury, first African American who was tenured at Harvard as an economist. He disagrees with all this anti-racism stuff. John McWhorter is an atheist at Columbia University. He disagrees with all this anti-racism stuff. So we've got a uniting now of liberal atheists and conservative Christians against the new left, this Marxist left, which isn't about liberal and conservative, Democrat and Republican. It is a foreign ideology in America that came from Marx and has infiltrated in good Gramscian ways under cultural Marxism to infiltrate the civil society. And once you've done that, then is the push for the frontal attack. As goes the university, so goes the culture. As goes the US university, so goes the world. And that's why we're trying to reach universities. And that's all I got to say about that. I don't have more time. Sorry.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Miller. I appreciate that. We're in overtime. I'll probably take a couple of questions. If short questions, short answers from those who haven't asked questions yet. Anybody?
Hello, Dr. Miller. I have a question.
Okay.
I found this question somehow interesting. Will there come a time when those people who call Jesus as Lord will be called racist? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, and look, it's not a concern about everyone in the race either. There are more babies aborted in New York City than babies that are born. And most of them by far are Black babies. We don't care about all Black Lives Matter. It's about Marxism. Patrisse Cullors now has $4 million homes. Where'd you get that money? Maybe Purdue paid her well, or speaking engagements. But she's not living in tents like the rest of them. She's a good capitalist. Mao owned an entire nation. It's never about the things they're complaining about. Marx really didn't care about the poor. He didn't care about his own family. Yes, we're going to be called racist. We're going to be called homophobes. We're going to be called whatever it takes to undermine and subvert biblical Christianity. If the rice card is not effective, it'll be a different card. We will be targets. The New Testament says we'll be targets. And much to the chagrin of the Marxist, we know what happens in the end. We know how to get there. We know how it ends. And in the spirit of Socrates, when his followers said, "How do you want to be buried?" And he said, "Any way you want, if you can find me." I am my soul and I have a body. This life is but a breath of air in light of eternity. My aim is not politics. My aim is souls. Ratio Christi, the two concentric, the Venn diagram, one square stands for apologetics, the other for evangelism. My
Amen.
heart of hearts is evangelism. I want to use philosophy to reach the highest levels of the most influential institution and the most influential post and go after professors personally. Are we going to get hit on the head? Yes. Look, I was in legal proceedings for being homophobic and charged with creating a suicidal environment in the university. As an undergrad, I got kicked out of class and I had to go legal. I got kicked out of the entire course. As a professor or as a PhD student, I lost my first PhD. I spent 5 years and I was told I had too much of a faith perspective and I had to terminate with a 5-year master's degree. That's what inspired me to go after professors, and I went on for a PhD a second time. It was costly on me, costly on my family. But the mind of man plans his way and the Lord directs his steps. And as we're faithful to the Lord, come what may, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm called to be faithful. That's it. This life is but a breath of air in light of eternity. And now, thankfully, he gave me this fine organization to work with. And now it was completely multiplied. We're on 140 campuses. We've had over 30 cases of legal proceedings. We have 2 federal victories. We recently contributed to a Supreme Court victory 3 months ago. And last month, we fended off litigation by some atheists that worked within the Biden administration to shut down religious groups to believe religious things. So yeah, they're coming after us in a big way. Even in America, a lot of people might think America's, Christian. Oh my goodness, all hell is broken loose, and no one knows where exactly it came from. But I've just shown you where tonight. It took a long time, but this whole thing reminds me of, remember Tom Cruise's movie, The War of the Worlds?
Mm-hmm.
Remember how there was some like space aliens that planted some machines under the surface of the earth, maybe thousands of years ago. And something triggered, and all of a sudden, all of them just started breaking out, taking over the world. And literally all hell broke loose, and it was bloody. That's what's happened. If you have not been on the campus at a U.S. university in 5 years, if you haven't been on the campus in 18 months, you wouldn't recognize it. The Dawkins of the world are shaking in their boots and apologizing. There's a new king in town. It's not the neo-atheist, it's the neo-Marxist.